Hello everyone, welcome to today's ARI Institute seminar. Pretty special one today because it's National Science Week. Before we start, I want to say hello, welcome everybody. My name's Fern Hames, I'm the director of the ARI Institute and really delighted to be bringing you the seminar today for Science Week. I'd also like to acknowledge that today I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country. Really special country. It's a little bit cold, but it's still a beautiful day. And I'd also like to acknowledge First Nations people as essentially the first scientists. When we're in National Science Week, it's good to think about all the different ways in which we understand the world, ask questions about the world, make observations about the world, and share the knowledge that we gather about the world while we're in National Science Week. So today we have two speakers. We've got Dr. Dave Ramsey, who's going to talk with us first about deer, particularly in a post-fire landscape. And Dr. Matt Bruce is going to talk to us about the Biodiversity Knowledge Portal. But first up, we're going to hear from Dave. And can I please encourage you, if you have questions about Dave's talk, pop them in the chat and Andy will deal with them straight after Dave's talk before we then progress to Matt. So, terrific that you're all here. Thanks for coming along today for our National Science Week seminar. Over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Fern. So I'm going to talk today about an analysis that I undertook on some aerial shooting data for the Bushfire Biodiversity Response and Recovery program. Before I get into my talk, just some acknowledgements. I'd like to acknowledge a few people in the department, especially Damien McMaster, who's a manager of the threat management program within the Bushfire Biodiversity Response program, and also Kalstov Dahal and Kimberly Height, who helped with technical issues. And also I'd like to thank the aerial shooting operations team in Parks Victoria, who provided some valuable feedback on this work. So just to kick things off, before we start looking at some aerial shooting data, I thought just have a quick chat about deer and the need for deer control. So in Australia, we have 6 species of deer who have established populations in Australia. And in Victoria, the dominant species here are sambar deer, fallow deer, red deer and hog deer. And in other parts of Australia, we also have chital deer, mainly in North Queensland, and also rooster deer. The deer have been introduced into many novel environments around the world, and wherever this has happened, the deer populations normally go through a phase of rapid increase where they can reach quite high densities. And globally, where they've done that, the impacts during this increased phase include things like significant impacts in understory biomass and reduction in species diversity. They've also been responsible for reducing growth and survival of canopy tree seedlings, which can lead to long-term sort of structural issues in the forest. However, aside from these biodiversity impacts, deer also are valued by recreational hunters. And in 2019, over 170,000 deer were reported to be harvested in Victoria alone. So that's quite a lot of deer by any stretch of the imagination. Just some background on the impetus for this particular project. So as we know, in 2019 and early 2020, we had extensive bushfires in Victoria, which burned approximately 1.5 million hectares of forest, mainly in eastern Victoria, East Gippsland and the northeast. And so in response to that, the department put together this Bushfire Biodiversity Response and Recovery program, which was designed to mitigate some of the threats to these bushfire areas as they're recovering from bushfires. And there was a special focus in eastern Victoria to do this because that's where the impacts of the bushfires were most severe. And we know from previous studies that deer will recolonise burnt areas within about 16 to 24 months post-fire. So in response to this potential impact of herbivores, especially deer in some of these bushfire recovering areas, aerial shooting was seen as a key tool to control a range of pest species, but especially deer. However, we don't really have any information about how effective aerial shooting is at reducing deer abundance. There's been a recent study looking at aerial control of mainly fallow deer in agricultural areas, but in terms of effectiveness of aerial control in some of these heavily forested mountainous areas, we really don't know how well it works. So the aims of this particular project were undertake an analysis of operational data collected from aerial shooting operations. And what we primarily wanted to do is determine how effective the control operation was at reducing deer. And to do that, we need to estimate pre and post-control densities of deer. Now, normally how you do this is you want to estimate densities of deer. You have to go out and do some additional sort of monitoring using remote cameras or spotlight counts or something of that sort. But we didn't have any of that sort of data here. The only data we had available were the actual operational data from the aerial shooting operation. So can we use that information to estimate deer densities and use that then to estimate the efficacy of control? So that's the the main subject of this talk. And once we've got that, we can then recommend intensity of control that might be needed to achieve some sort of set management target. So just a quick look at the aerial shooting operations that occurred in eastern Victoria. So we had access to aerial shooting data from 10 operational zones, mainly centred on national and regional parks in East Gippsland and the northeast parts of Victoria. From Burra Pine Mountain up in the northeast down to Crower-Jingalong National Park in the south. So the dark sort of shaded areas is the areas of forest that are affected by bushfires, and the coloured squiggly lines that you see are actually the GPS track logs of the helicopter as it's travelling around the forest searching for deer and other feral animals during the aerial shooting operations. So you can see that some of these areas had quite extensive search coverage. So areas like Snowy River National Park there in the centre had quite a lot of aerial search thrown at it during this program. A quick look at some of the data that I analysed. So the aerial shooting data that I looked at occurred between February 2020, so just after the end of the bushfires, to May 2021. And I, in particular, looked at data for sambar deer, which was by far the most dominant species of feral animal that was shot during the aerial shooting program. And for the 10 operational zones, over 4,000 sambar deer were shot over this period, with more than half the deer, over 2,700 sambar deer shot in the Snowy River National Park. And during that time, aerial search effort amounted to over 27,000 kilometres of helicopter search effort was conducted in these removal operations. So that was basically the data that I had available. So it was basically the number of deer removed in each of these 10 operational zones and the amount of helicopter search effort that was conducted during the aerial shooting program. So how do we make use of this data to estimate how effective aerial shooting is at reducing deer abundance? So I applied what are called sort of catch effort models to the removal data during the aerial shooting. And these catch effort models were first developed quite some time ago, the 40s and 50s, to estimate stock size in fisheries. So you can imagine during sort of normal sort of fisheries operations, we have trawlers go out and they catch fish. So that's the catch. And So they know how many fish are caught during each trawl operation, and we know how many trawlers were operating in a particular area during that time. So that's the effort. And so scientists wanted to know, well, can we estimate the stock size from the catch of fish and the amount of trawl effort that was produced? And it turns out you can. And basically these models rely on the actual removals resulting in a depletion of the population. As you're going out removing animals, the population's being depleted. And if that occurs, you can use the catch and the search effort to estimate the depletion rate in the population occurring over as each successive sort of trawl operation or whatever is occurring. And this depletion rate is related to, for our particular data, set, depletion is related to detection rate of deer from the helicopter and also the initial population size of deer, so before the removals. And given that you know the initial population size, you also know the number of deer removed, you can also then estimate the residual, what we call the residual population size, which is the population size following the removals. So these are the sorts of models that were applied to this data. So just having a quick look at the data structure and how the data was organised for the analysis. So as I mentioned, we had aerial shooting data from operations occurring between February 2020 and May 2021, which is quite a long period of time, sort of 18 months. But there was a natural sort of grouping of the operational data. So rather than look at it all as in one big lump, I decided to divide the data into 3 sort of sessions of data of roughly 4 months for each of these sessions, February, May 2020 to February, May 2021. So within each of these sessions, we organised each of the individual aerial shooting mission data into these 5 removal periods. So each removal period was roughly a sort of a couple of weeks duration. So we grouped the aerial mission data, the removal data and the effort data into 5 periods underneath each session. And the idea is that we tried to estimate what the population size of deer is for each of these, separately for each of these 3 sessions of data. And we can do that if we assume a couple of things. And one of the main assumptions for these models is that within a particular session, we assume that the population is close to natural additions and losses. So that means there's things like populations, births or deaths or immigration to the population are basically absent or extremely minimal within a session. And so basically the only way the population really changes within a session is due to the removals from the aerial shooting. However, between each of these sessions, we do allow the population to change due to births or deaths or immigration and emigration. And so we can actually estimate these changes between each of these 3 sessions. So we can look at the effect of the removals at reducing the population, accounting for these natural additions to the population as well. So that was how the data was structured for the analysis. So the first thing we did is we wanted to look at to see whether the removal data was actually causing some sort of depletion in the population, because that's what's really required to estimate population abundance. And one way of doing this is to look at a statistic called catch per unit effort. So for each removal period, if you look at the number of removals, number of deer removed, and divide it by the search effort, you basically got catch per unit of search effort or catch per unit effort. And we look at how this progresses over time as deer are removed. So along the x-axis there, we have cumulative number of deer removed, and on the y-axis, we have this catch per unit effort. So if deer are being depleted, you should see a decline in catch per unit effort as deer are removed. So the more deer are removed, catch per unit effort decreases. So if you see this sort of negative relationship with CPUE and cumulative removals, that indicates that the deer population is being depleted. However, if removal rate is not sufficiently high, you'll get the sort of no relationship or no decline in the catch per unit effort with cumulative number of removals. And that means they've really got an inadequate depletion rate. Population is probably not being depleted. And so, use of these models to try and estimate population size may not work in this situation. So we're having a looking at these catch per unit effort curves or relationships for our 10 operational areas that we had aerial shooting data for. We can see that for zones such as Snowy River National Park, Mount Buffalo National Park, Alpine National Park, especially the Bogong High Plains, you can see this negative relationship between CPUE and cumulative removal, so indicating there's probably been some good depletion of the deer population occurring in these zones. Other zones, it's less obvious that this has occurred. So zones like Crowe-Jingalong and Erranundra and Wobber Wilderness Park, this will be less evidence that there's that the aerial shooting has caused depletion of the deer population. However, we're analysing all these operational zones in the one model, so we can use help data for some of the zones where we have getting good depletion going on. Would probably help us make some inference for some of these other areas where there's probably less evidence of a deer depletion. So the first thing we wanted to do is these models estimate what the detection and removal rate of deer is for each of these 10 operational areas. So this gives us some idea about how efficient the helicopter search effort has been. So we get estimates of the aerial detection probability. So this is the probability that deer are detected and removed for each kilometre of aerial search effort per kilometre squared of area searched. So each of these zones are colour-coded. So on average, there was about just less than 10% probability of detection of deer per kilometre of a search effort per kilometre squared of habitat searched. Highest at zones like Mount Buffalo, with just less than about 12% probability of detection, and lowest in zones like Crowe-Jingalong, which had less than 5% probability of detection. And we had fairly good estimates for most zones except for Cooper-Canberra, where the uncertainty in the detection rate was really quite low. So fairly uncertain detection probability in that particular zones, just due to the low number of deer that removed from that zone. So given that we could estimate detection rates, we then use that in the model to estimate initial and residual densities of sambar deer. So here are the estimates of initial population density for sambar deer over the 3 sessions of removals for each of the 10 zones. So along the x-axis, we've got session number 1, 2, and 3. The blue lines indicate the initial density of deer, so the density of deer before the removal during that session, and the red line is the density of deer following the removal in that session, so the residual density. The density is deer per kilometre squared. So, zones like Snowy River National Park had the highest densities of deer, up around the 4 deer per kilometre squared before aerial shooting operations began. Other zones like the Alpine National Park had around 2 deer per kilometre squared. Zones like Crowe-Jingalong and Wobber Wilderness Park, 1 deer per kilometre squared. And so you can see that we had some good declines in deer densities for some zones, especially Snowy River and Mount Buffalo, smaller ones in the Alpine National Park, and very minor changes in deer density for some of these other zones. So from these initial and residual population densities, we could estimate what we wanted to was how effective the aerial shooting operations at reducing deer abundance. So here is the estimates of aerial shooting efficacy for each of these 10 zones. And efficacy here was looking at the difference in sambar deer density between the first session, so initial density in the first session before the start of the operations, and the final residual density in the third session. So the zones like Mount Buffalo National Park had very high population declines, over 80% decline in sambar deer density there, and fairly good level of certainty in that. So the last two columns, LCI and UCI, are the 95% confidence intervals of the estimated decline. So between 71 and 91% decline for Mount Buffalo, 70% for Snowy River National Park, 60% estimated decline in Mount Mitamita Regional Park, 50% in the Alpine National Park and the Bogon High Plains, and so on down the list, to around 20% estimated decline in some of the national parks like Erranundra and Crowe-Jingalong. And also you can see for those particular national parks, we didn't have very good levels of certainty in our estimates. So quite high uncertainty for some zones, especially Cooper-Canberra National Park, where we didn't have a very good estimate at all about what level of decline occurred there. The estimates indicated that the population could entertain the possibility that an increase could have occurred. But for at least 5 of the zones, or 4 of the zones, we had pretty good estimates that aerial control was pretty efficient at reducing sambar deer densities. It's pretty good news. The other thing that we can do with these data is to estimate, well, if we wanted to achieve a certain level of population reduction in deer or to achieve a set target density, how much helicopter search effort do we need? And so I contrasted 2 sort of particular zones. For example, a zone where detection rates of deer were fairly high, such as Mount Buffalo, and detection rates were fairly low, such as Crowe-Jingalong. So we can see this left graph here. If we want to achieve a population reduction of around about 80% for 2 sites such as these, we'd need probably an aerial search effort of around 3 kilometres of search effort per kilometre squared of habitat to achieve an 80% reduction for, say, something like Mount Buffalo. However, for a site with low detection like Crowe-Jingalong, we'd probably need at least 5, probably even more search effort to achieve that level of reduction. So we could, if we turn this on its head, and so we wanted to reduce deer density, say from 1.5 deer per kilometre squared down to say a target of 0.5 deer per kilometre squared, corresponding search effort we would need for a zone with high detection, like Mount Buffalo. We need at least 2 kilometres of search effort per kilometre squared of habitat for that particular zone, and for a zone with low detection, we'd need at least 4 kilometres of search effort. So that's one of the useful things that comes out of this analysis, that gives some clear guidance about sort of management to achieve certain management targets, how much search effort might be required, and which can be used in a sort of a planning scenario. So just in conclusion, I think this analysis has shown that aerial control of deer has been quite effective and can achieve quite high reductions in deer density with concerted aerial search effort. So where we can undertake at least, say, 3 kilometres of aerial search effort per kilometre squared of habitat, we could achieve sort of this level of population reduction over about sort of 5 removal periods would probably take to do that. However, some areas have been harder to achieve those sorts of population reductions. So especially in zones such as Crow-Jingalong and Cooper-Canberra, probably had low initial densities of deer to start with, and also they had lower detection rates. So, and the reason of this is probably unknown, but could be due to things like heavier canopy cover or higher levels of undergrowth, making search quite a bit difficult in those sorts of zones. I think these sorts of models, these catch effort models, have been quite useful for estimating efficacy of pest control operations. And one of their main advantages is that we don't require any additional monitoring in order to get these sorts of estimates. So we don't have to go out and set cameras or do extra spotlight counts. We can just estimate. We've been able to estimate deer abundance just from the operational data by itself, which is a distinct advantage. However, the only caveat with the use of these models is that the removal rate for these sorts of operations must be adequate to deplete the population. Otherwise, it's very hard to get population estimates from them. And just like to leave it there, and thanks for listening, and I'm happy to entertain any questions on any part of the study. So thanks very much.
Applause from the floor everywhere. Dave, thank you so much. And that's very cute that you ended with the end of a deer at the end. I see what you did there. Thank you so much. I mean, just such a massive job. I think many of us would have noticed that we seem to be seeing a lot of deer in the landscape lately, whether we're out walking in the bush or driving on roads. We're certainly seeing a lot of deer and aware of the damage that they're causing in the bush as well. Andy, how are we going for questions? Are people curious about this? What have we got in the question column? I'll have a look here.
Well, it's a good question, Fern. We have more than 200 people in and not a single question just yet. So clearly Dave has answered all questions possible about deer and the measuring them or monitoring them. So here's one.
We do have one. We've got one about, there's so Ian Temby's asked a question about how are you detecting the deer? So this is sort of going back to the start of your talk, really. Is thermal gear being used to detect deer or just looking without such aids?
No, that's a good question. No, it was all undertaken during the day using Mark 1 eyeball.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to speak about one. Oh no, they're flooding in now. Oh, now I'm going to have to keep up with them all. There's a question here about thoughts on repopulation from surrounding state forests.
Yeah, so we did get some estimates of sort of recolonisation occurring between those three sorts of sessions. So between the first and second session, there was a slight increase in deer density, so not related to the removals, obviously, but related to probably movement of deer. And between the second and third session, there was actually a slight decrease. So, obviously there's only been a few months elapsed between each of those three sessions. So over the longer term, we don't really know what the recolonisation rate might be, but that's something that might be able to be answered with other monitoring that's going around the place.
Great, thank you, Dave. I've got a question here about increasing the hunting effort. Could it create avoidance behaviours in the animals that you're hoping to detect? And would that maybe change the catch per unit effort?
Yeah, so deer do learn to avoid persecution. So one of the, deer might get harder to detect from the helicopter or from the ground if they're, repeatedly being persecuted by, either by aerial or ground hunting. Deer, they're quite smart and they will learn to sort of avoid the area, making them a bit harder to shoot. So it does mean that more search effort is required as time goes on in order to keep the removal, keep the depletion rate, going.
Thanks very much. This is a question about detection rates. In your talk, you talk about the sambar deer. Are there different detection rates for different types of deer?
Yeah, there was. I did look at fallow deer. That was the other deer species that was shot in these areas. However, there was too few real fallow deer to get a really solid handle on what the detection rates were. But I can't imagine it'd be too much different to sambar deer. I mean, fallow deer are a little bit smaller, but apart from that, unless they were behaviourally, doing something different, then the detection rates are likely to be quite similar for the different deer species.
Great. This one's around managing deer closer to urban areas. Your talk, you speak about kind of more remote places. Can the same techniques be used in urban deer control?
Yeah, there's obviously some issues with using aerial shooting in built-up areas. It's probably not something that would be contemplated, I'd imagine. So other techniques have to be used in sort of closer to built-up areas and urban centres. Including probably a high reliance on ground control.
Thank you. Final question. Are you going to publish this information and the research that you've been doing?
Yes, in fact, we are going to publish this particular analysis. There's a special issue on sort of deer management coming up in the Journal of Wildlife Research, and our intention is to publish this as part of that special issue.
Thank you so much, Dave, for all those great answers, and for the audience for the massive flurry of questions. We're sorry we couldn't get through them all. I'm going to send it back to Fern.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Dave. And there's quite a flurry of questions there, and I noticed a couple of people asking if they could get a copy of the presentation. Just worth noting that all of these seminars are recorded and they'll turn up on the ARI website in a few days as a recording. So not so much a PDF of the talk, but you can certainly access the recording and get access to that. So thanks so much, Dave. So many questions from many of us, of course, about what's next and a bit of detail around that kind of work. Next, we're going to go to Matt Bruce, and Matt is going to talk with us about the Biodiversity Knowledge Portal. So, how do we know which are the most important questions we should be addressing for research and management? How do we make those decisions? So, because, it'd be great to know everything. Matt is going to run us through this. Thank you so much, Matt. Over to you.
Sorry, I was just having trouble unmuting while I was presenting. I'll just share again. My apologies. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm coming to you from Bunurong country on the Mornington Peninsula today. So I'd just like to extend my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and any traditional owners or Aboriginal people listening online today. So today actually feeds in quite nicely with what Dave was talking about in a sense. So Dave talked about deer control and some of the uncertainties around we saw from his presentation that there's a lot of variation in potentially the effectiveness of deer control in different locations, and that might vary with species, or it might have something to do with the location, or there might be something else going on. So my talk today is about a broader kind of conception of how we might prioritise these knowledge gaps for better investment into understanding or research into solving some of these conservation problems, specifically related to conservation problems in Victoria, and more specifically related to the things that DELP is particularly interested in. So first up, I'd just like to acknowledge some of the people that have been involved in this work. This is ongoing for several years, and it comes out of the Biodiversity 2037, or the Biodiversity Plan, as we like to shorthand it. So several people in DELP biodiversity strategy and knowledge, and other people more broadly in the biodiversity division, particularly Anne Buchan, who's been a great supporter of some of this, a lot of this work, and her team. Helen Jenny deserves a particular shout out for all her hard work in getting this work online. Our collaborators at University of Melbourne, who effectively derived this this idea and have helped us facilitate workshops and design the analysis and that sort of thing. So Terry and Libby, and Jim Thompson, who's been responsible for helping us integrate this, at least partially to this stage, with Strategic Management Prospects tool, and Kanran Liu, who has produced a lot of the R code that's allowed us to do some of the analysis. So the first question really is, why do we want to prioritise acquiring new knowledge in the biodiversity space? And this is a question that agencies that fund practical and relevant research have to ask themselves. It's not just in biodiversity, of course, it occurs in medical research, it occurs in engineering, it occurs in all sorts of fields of endeavour. And this is principally because we're uncertain about the effectiveness of the action. So when we apply an action to a threat, we get sort of varying outcomes. So we're kind of unsure about why. Sometimes we get the outcome that we desire, and sometimes we get less than optimal outcomes. Obviously, if we had unlimited resources, we would just go out and learn about everything, and we wouldn't bother too much about prioritising where we want to learn, but we have limited resources. And it's not always clear where the uncertainties are. So we need a way of kind of picking apart the uncertainties in a problem and trying to work out which are the key ones, which are the highest priorities. And we need to kind of work through that. And it's a bit of a thought experiment as much as anything else. And of course, not all new information is useful. So on our next slide, we have a bit of a kind of matrix here that points us in the direction of where we might want to invest in new knowledge. So on the left-hand side there, on that kind of vertical axis, we can be in a binary sense, and of course this is continuous, get an understanding of how uncertain we are. If we're not very uncertain and our actions don't make much difference, then there's not really much priority in understanding the problem or investing in research. As opposed to down the bottom right-hand corner there, where we see that where we think an action might make a big difference, so we get a big payoff in that sort of lingo, and we're very uncertain, then we have a high priority, because this gives us the opportunity to resolve big uncertainties that we think will make a big difference. So these are actions that we might implement if the big payoff comes through, and we probably wouldn't do if there was a small payoff, but there's a big amount of uncertainty there. So for us, these are the sort of prioritization principles that we wanted to apply to this work. We wanted something that's transparent, so we can kind of see inside the uncertainties, the knowledge gaps. We want it to be consistently applied and updatable, and we have some sort of sub principles here. So applying the same logic across a breadth of broad scale management actions and specific actions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of case studies later on in the talk. Obviously it needs to be relevant to conservation problems in Victoria, so this is pretty important. So it needs to kind of in some way, at least in some way, integrate with some of our management planning tools. We use a consistent metric, and this sort of circles back to applying the same logic across different scales. And here we need to be able to update with new information where we're able to resolve knowledge gaps, or we have emerging issues. So it needs to, in some ways, it needs to be modular in the sense that we can kind of update parts of it without having to revisit the whole process. So how do we know which uncertainties we want to resolve? So we already have a tool for prioritising management actions. It's called Strategic Management Prospects, and this is a broad scale tool that can be applied across the state or in smaller subsets of the state that tell us about how cost effective particular actions are to remove threats like predator control, for example, or deer control. It's another one for particular species or groups of species in the state. So how what's the payoff? And this is how for a particular unit of cost. But of course, this comes with some uncertainties. This is an expert-derived tool, and experts differ in their opinions about what might happen to particular species when we implement actions at a certain location. So we can use uncertainty in SMP to identify and broadly rank these knowledge gaps. So a knowledge gap like, if we apply deer control, what's the outcome for a particular species, for example, that we might be interested in? But this can't tell us specifically where the knowledge gaps are. It can't really tell us why we're uncertain. It can only tell us sort of broadly that there is some uncertainty there. And if it's not in SMP, so specific, strategic management prospects deals with some pretty broad scale actions that we do, broad scale threats, but there's lots of other things that we might do that don't appear in the strategic management prospects tool. And this goes back to the idea that we want this to prioritization to work across different scales and different types of actions. So why are we uncertain about things? So if we apply some predator control, we're unsure. We might be unsure about the outcome for some particular species of birds that they prey on. Now, strategic management prospects can tell us that there's some quantum of uncertainty here, but it can't really tell us why we're uncertain. And this is something that's going on in the minds of a bunch of different experts. Everybody has a kind of mental model about how this system might work and where the kind of key points of uncertainty are, and where we might, if we improve our knowledge in those areas, we might actually get a better outcome. We might apply the treatment differently. We might eliminate some factors that co-occur. So we might apply other treatments at the location, these sorts of things, or it might be specific to a particular location. So we use a metric here to rank our uncertainties, and in the what we're calling the biodiversity knowledge framework, we call this metric the relative benefit of knowledge. And this is made up of two other metrics. One is the expected gain from resolving all uncertain elements. So if we knew, if we resolve every uncertainty in a problem, acknowledging that we have to make some assumptions about where the boundaries of that problem are, this is the amount of gain we would get. So this is equivalent in the kind of decision logic or decision sciences to the expected value of perfect information. And we can derive this from analysis of strategic management prospects. And if these problems don't occur in strategic management prospects, we can derive this from another process. And I'll talk about that in the second half of the talk. But this only tells us the kind of overall amount of uncertainty we've got within it, but doesn't tell us what's going on within that problem. It doesn't tell us what the specific uncertainties are. So we have another factor that we estimate in this process, and it's called the proportional reduction in uncertainty, and it's equivalent to the expected value of partial information. And this is something that is new in the what we're calling the knowledge framework. This is something that we've developed for this process. So the expected value of perfect information is relatively easy to estimate, particularly if we're doing it for specific problems, and the expected value of partial information has proven difficult to estimate. So like I said before, the first one is the value of resolving all uncertainties in a decision problem, and the second one is the value of resolving a subset of key uncertainties. And this is hard to calculate, and we develop a new method, and I'll talk through this a bit more in both case studies, but particularly in case study 2. So just on the top corner, just to remind you of our equation, talk a bit more about expected gain. These are the two things that are really important to kind of get out of this talk, I suppose, how we calculate these things, not the mathematics particularly, but more or less why we do this. So it represents the value of all uncertainties, just to reiterate that point, and it can be calculated from uncertainty in strategic management prospects. So we can effectively mine the information in strategic management prospects, and I'll talk about this in the first case study. Or where the information isn't in strategic management prospects, we can use another process, which I'll talk about in case study 2. So this is effectively a textbook kind of decision table process. So we've done this in strategic management prospects. We've ranked the top knowledge gaps for particular groups of native species. So as you can see, the top 10 are mostly about control of things, goat control, weed control, deer control, predator control, so cats and foxes, on various native groups of native things, so plants, ground-dwelling birds. These are things like plains wanderer and malleefowl and those sorts of things that I showed you before. And the one I've highlighted here is the one I'm going to be talking about in the case study. Don't need to worry about the numbers. That's the expected gain. So that's the first side of the equation. Just to say that they're fairly close together. So there's not much resolution in this calculation, except for perhaps the top one stands out a little bit more. But they're dimensionless numbers, and their magnitude isn't important outside of the problem. So the fact that they're low doesn't concern us. And then you've got our other part of the equation, the proportional reduction in uncertainty. So here, this is equivalent to the expected value of partial information. And we derive this by comparison between two plausible but contrasting models. And we term these the best and worst case. But the most important thing to remember here is that these are bookends that represent some sort of plausible understanding of how the system works. And they're two extreme but plausible versions of that. And where those models differ, we have some uncertainty. So these models will differ in particular elements. And these models are represented as causal models, so they're represented as diagrams. I'll show you some of those, but they're also represented as matrices. And so if you're interested in matrix mathematics, then I'm not going to show you any of those equations, but they can be resolved using some matrix calculations. And so we can calculate the proportional contribution, of each uncertainty. So each uncertainty is represented by a link in a model, basically a link in a causal model, or a cell in a matrix. So where two parts of the matrix intersect. And from these, we can generate testable hypotheses. And the important thing is the calculation is always the same. So they're kind of comparable, and we can automate this process to a certain extent. So I'm going to show you two case studies now. One is the first case study is where we have the action and the target species group in strategic management prospects. So that was the effect of predator control, fox and cat specifically, on ground-dwelling birds. So we can derive our uncertainty from strategic management prospects, and this is a computationally expensive process, but conceptually fairly straightforward. I'm not going to go through that, so I will ignore that for the purposes of today's talk. And we derive our proportional reduction in uncertainty from contrasting causal models. In the second case study, we have an action and a target species group that's not in SMP, for that particular action anyway, or at least at that location. So we've kind of dialed it down to a much smaller area, and for one species in particular, fat-tailed dunnart. So we need to derive our expected gain from a different process because we can't mine the uncertainty in SMP, but we still use the same process to understand the kind of internal uncertainties to derive our proportional reduction in uncertainty metric. So case study 1 is one of our key uncertainties that we derive from SMP. So remember our calculation here, the relative benefit knowledge expected gain. It's the first part. We've already worked that out. It took us several weeks in SMP to do that, but that's okay. We've done it now, and we need to derive the second part. So these are our contrasting causal models. So remember our plausible kind of bookends of how the world might work. So we've derived these expert-derived models. So what we do is we get our experts to kind of have a discussion about how this might work, and they're generally done by consensus. So what we want to do is kind of capture, after the experts discuss these things, typically 3 to 6 or 7 people, depending on the problem, we'll get them to build a model of how they think the world works. And we have nodes and edges. The edges we call links, just for to make it a bit easier for people to understand. We generally try to express the nodes in terms of a quantity of something that can go up or down. Now, when we draw them, they're kind of shorthanded, but you can think about things like the cat and fox density is something that can go up and down with the quantum of control that you apply to a certain place. The amount of predation pressure can go up and down. The cover of various plant species, the density of other species that might exist in the system that might alter the outcomes, and of course the probability of persistence of the target species, which are illustrated in green here. So this is what we would call the best case model. This is the best outcome for biodiversity. And then there's the worst case, the other bookend, which is shown here with some red links. So we've grayed out the links that don't differ. So we really want to kind of capture things that not, just a little bit of uncertainty, but a reasonable amount of uncertainty. So we're trying to peg this to things that are, that could vary quite a bit. So we changed the color here just to illustrate that. But generally speaking, where we've got differences in those two models, that's where we have uncertainty in those links. So we could potentially develop hypotheses for things like if we apply more cat control or more fox control, cat and fox density, well, we would predict that would go down. But in this case, it could go down by a lot in the best case, or in the worst case, it only goes down by a little bit. So there's an uncertainty that could be resolved. So we've done this for a bunch of those links in those previous models, and we talk about things like the impact. So the top one for this particular problem was the impact of rabbits on predation. So having rabbits in the system seems to kind of disrupt it, and it might be an uncertainty in terms of why you might not get effective fox and or cat control. And the numbers on the left-hand side just show how much they rank in the kind of overall scheme of things. So because we've got 10 of these problems at the moment that have come out of SMP, or 10 of these types of models, each of those has several of these uncertainties that could be turned into research projects or research questions. There's several hundred of these that can be ranked by the relative benefit of knowledge calculation. As you can see, this one stands out. So the top one from this one is number 6 overall. And these are the top 7 or so with ties. So as you can see, I've just highlighted where it fits into the general scheme of things. You can also see from this that that deer control is one of our key uncertainties. So we can see that Dave's actually working hard on resolving a lot of those uncertainties separately from this process. But nevertheless, we can certainly revisit that and take in some of the information that he's producing. Just a quick aside here. So there's a bunch of models that we've produced and a bunch of these things that can be explored. So there's a QR code if you've got your phone there. You can take a photo of that, or however you kind of link to that, or the Biodiversity Knowledge Portal. And the Biodiversity Knowledge Portal is an interactive way of exploring these models. So it gives you the opportunity. I've just highlighted one link. This is just a screenshot, so it's not dynamic here, but one of the links in blue here, cat and fox density to rat density. So we see here some information about those things and what these say. We've got a proportional reduction in uncertainty, expected gain, and the relative benefit of knowledge from resolving that link. And you can explore it on the basis of threats. So the threat being cats and foxes, or a particular group of target species that you might be interested in. Of course, this is not exhaustive. It's only the top uncertainties from strategic management prospects. So there aren't hundreds of these. There's 10 or so sets of these things. So if you want to go and have a look at it now, if you sick of what I'm saying, or you can check it out later. Okay, case study 2. So this is a situation where we don't have this particular intervention in strategic management prospects. So effectively, the starting point is we've got no idea about how to calculate the expected gain from this. This can be used in specific circumstances. This is a real world example. We did it early in the process. So some of the details of the scenario may have changed, but I'm presenting it here as an illustration. So this is translocation problem. So we want to take translocation reintroduction actually. So we want to take some dunnarts from somewhere and move them to somewhere else in the landscape, and we want to try and understand where our biggest uncertainties are. And the other thing here is we can actually use this process to make a decision about whether or not the action is cost effective. So we haven't seen the expected gain calculation yet. Case study 1 was done via strategic management prospects. We've already seen how we derive this proportional reduction in uncertainty, but I'll run you through that again for this case study. So we have a new method here that integrates kind of the textbook way of this sort of decision science approach to whether or not you implement the action, and then we have the additional step of calculating our kind of uncertainty for those individual links within our models, our contrasting models. So we need to assign a critical threshold for cost effectiveness. That is how much change in probability of persistence or proportion you would like to get for a particular amount of money you invest. In this case, it's kind of $1 million for $1 million. We then elicit judgments for the benefit of the action under best and worst case causal models. So we create our causal models, and then we try and work out from expert opinion using a Delphi process. So the Delphi process whereby experts give their initial estimates, and then we have a discussion, and then they give their final estimates for these things. And I'll show you the outcome of that for this case study. We can then calculate the cost effectiveness of the action under both of these models. So if one were true or the other were true, and given that we also estimate the likelihood that these two models are true, we can then go and proceed to decide whether or not we would implement the action first. So if the interval of uncertainty in these cost effectivenesses straddle the critical threshold, this is an action that would potentially be implemented because there's potential payoff for doing it, or it's efficient. And then we also proceed to the calculation of the expected gain, the right-hand side of our equation, to work out the relative benefit of knowledge for this process. So we calculate the relative benefit of knowledge. So this is the scenario here. So we develop a scenario so everybody's kind of on the same page. So we're targeting, our target site is Glenley Reserve. We're sourcing in population from 2 locations, Terek and Bale. We've got 30 to 40 individuals collectively in 3 operations. And we're doing a few other things like spread coarse woody debris to provide shelter. We've estimated the cost of this action to be $300,000. And our hypothetical cost efficiency for the illustration purposes is 0.5. So that's a willingness to pay up to $1 million for an improvement of 0.5 in the probability of persistence. We've got our best case causal model here. Sorry, we don't have the prettier versions these weren't done by graphic designers. Not quite at that stage yet, but we've got a bunch of blue on this, so mainly up in this top left-hand corner and a little bit over in the top right-hand corner. And when you contrast that with the worst case causal model, we see where the differences in these causal models are according to the experts. Don't need to worry about the details of that so much for this example. Okay, so we get experts to estimate the chance of persistence if the best case were true and the worst case were true with and without the action. So the kind of status quo was without the action, and then we asked them to also estimate that with the action. So the expectation obviously is that the chance of persistence is higher with the action implemented. And we're also interested in what the difference is between the chance of persistence if the best case were true and if the worst case were true. So generally speaking, if the best case were true, we expect a higher chance of persistence than if the worst case were true. And so that's what our experts have estimated here. So we've got 6 experts that went through this process, and we used the pooled best and worst to calculate our cost efficiency. We also have to estimate the plausibility of each of these models, the probability that the best case is true, which is the lime green, and the probability that the worst case is true is this other sort of Delpy green color. I'm not quite sure what we call this. And generally speaking, the experts suggested to us that in this case, the best case was a bit more plausible or likely to be true than the worst case, although there was one that disagreed with that and another one that thought they were equally likely. But in any case, we're able to use the pooled judgments of the experts. So we'll talk about cost efficiency. So remember that our critical threshold here is 0.5. So if this were the case, we wouldn't implement the action, because even in the best case scenario, the cost efficiency falls below the line. So it's not a cost efficient action. We wouldn't do it. If this were the case, it's kind of a no-brainer action. Even if the worst case model were true, you just go ahead and do it anyway, because it's value for money, even if in the most pessimistic scenario. But our case here, luckily for us, because it makes this more interesting, is that our threshold is right almost smack bang in the middle of our cost efficiency, 0.72 if the best case were true and 0.19 if the worst case were true. So these haven't shown you the tables that we have to go through. It's a bit too much for a talk, but this is what we can do. So then we can proceed to calculating the benefit of learning in this case. So just to summarize that, if the worst case were true, we wouldn't act because it falls below our threshold. But if the best case were true, we would act. So we need to kind of resolve this. Well, this is a good candidate for resolving the uncertainty. And the overall expected gain here, I haven't shown you the calculations, but it's 0.073. So combining all those bits of information, we have now our expected gain, which is the same, because that's our that's the left-hand side of our multiplication here. That's equivalent to the uncertainty that we derive from strategic management prospects for those broader scale problems. And from our causal models, from our contrasting causal models, we can see which are the biggest knowledge gaps within the problem. And then we can use that to rank. Obviously, within this problem, it doesn't make any difference. We can just, of course, use the proportional reduction because they're all multiplied by the same factor. But if we wanted to compare across problems, we could multiply them together and use this to derive our relative benefit of knowledge calculation. So the highest one here is actually the impact of grazing on survivability. So Dunart surviving within the habitat. And there's a bunch of other ones there of diminishing relative benefit of knowledge. And this one is almost about 50% higher than the second highest ranked one. So just in conclusion, I guess I wanted to revisit our objectives for this process, the transparent, consistent and updatable process for identifying knowledge gaps. So we're at the stage where we're trying to implement and apply the same logic to a breadth of broad scale problems like in case study 1 and specific management actions in case study 2. At the moment, we're not quite there yet. We have to do a little bit more work to determine whether or not our relative benefit of knowledge calculations can be compared, but we're getting there. They're relevant to conservation problems in Victoria, so they're either the things that we're already doing, the threats that we're trying to manage and the uncertainties within those, or they're actions that might actually be undertaken on a more bespoke basis. We're using a consistent metric, so we have one metric that can be applied across all these scales, subject to the kind of caveat that we need to do a little bit more work to work out if they're exactly the same. And we can update them with new information. So we can produce, if we get new information, we can go out and produce a bunch of new causal models, for example. We don't need to revisit all the other causal models because they're kind of self-contained subunits of the problem. So we can update this, our cat control and ground dwelling bird model. If we get new information, if someone says, hey, look, yeah, you've missed something, you've missed a key bit of research, or if someone implements some research that is funded by the government or by somebody else, we can update those models, and we can use that another expert elicitation process to do that. Or we can even update the structure of those models if we think that we may have got them wrong in the first instance. We have an opportunity, there's the ability on the website to send an email through, and it will identify the particular links that you've identified that you think might be of interest. So I encourage you to go and have a look if there are particular things on there that you're interested in or expert in, and you think that maybe we need to update some of those models. They might be a little bit wrong. There's some information that you're aware of that we weren't aware of at the time. It's an automated process that you can send that information through to us, and it'll get through to the knowledge team in Biodiversity Division. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I've gone a little bit over time, so I apologise for that. And yeah, hopefully we have time for a couple of questions at least.
Well done, Matt. Thank you very much. That's a really challenging topic to describe, and you've done an exceptional job at explaining it. I've got one question which we have time for. This is a question from Rick, and he's asking about whether we can feed back information from these models to the experts into SMP to help them improve the estimates.
Yes, that's a really, really, really good question, Rick. So the way in which we would do that at the moment would be if you were to run, you'd have to run another round of SMP elicitation, and you would make people specifically aware of anything that's changed or new since the last time that they did that, or if they hadn't been involved in the first place. So you would prepare what you might call an evidence dossier, and you'd highlight new evidence and say, does this new evidence, and ask the experts specifically or passively, we haven't really decided how we might do that, whether or not that new evidence has changed their opinion. Or just run a new round and you kind of do it in a naive way where you just say, we just present them with the evidence and say, okay, go ahead and do it as if you did it last time, and we'll see if it's changed anything in SMP. But yeah, at the moment, that's the way you'd have to do it.
Matt, that is fantastic. Thank you so much. I have lots of questions in my head, which are basically what if questions, but we can chat about that at ARI one day.
Yeah, absolutely. And happy to take emails about this sort of stuff as well, and talk to people offline if they want to.
Terrific. Actually, maybe while I'm just concluding, could either you or Andy just pop in the chat the link to the portal on the website so people, in case they missed that very clever QR code that you included in your talk. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to conclude now and say thank you so much to everybody for coming along today. Thanks, of course, to our speakers, Dave and Matt, for their presentations for National Science Week. Big thanks to Andy for all the tech behind the scenes, to Tess for assisting with that as well. And we hope that we'll see you next time. Next time is the 19th of September. We're going to have two speakers. We've got Justin Kelly talking on koalas, I think, and Jeff Hurd on Threatened Species Index. So hope to see you then. Enjoy the rest of your National Science Week. There's lots on. Jump on and check out all the things that you might be able to do and ask questions and explore the world. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care. Bye.